I want to formally welcome you all. We're really excited to welcome author Eric Klinenberg, class of 93, author of We Were Wrong About What Happened in 2020 as part of the Brown Global Alumni Career Initiative. My name is Alexia Benros. I am the Career Network Coordinator for the Office of Alumni Relations, and I sit on the Career and Life Design team. The Career and Life Design programs in the Brown Office of Alumni Relations is comprised of career and mentoring opportunities to build our Brunonian communities. The three pillars of career and life design include early engagement, experimental engagement, and life after graduation, which are all points that we've been touching on throughout this initiative. So through workshops, one-on-one coaching, and innovative resources, we aim to empower our alumni to design their lives, building valuable networks, making connections with employers, and alumni to alumni connections to stay current with a diverse array of possibilities and fostering a sense of purpose and direction. So today we'll get to hear from Eric Klinenberg, class of 93, to discuss his book, 2020, One City, Seven People, and the Year Everything Changed, which allows us to see 2020 and ultimately ourselves with unprecedented clarity and empathy. His book not only helps us reckon with what we live through, but also with the challenges we face before the next crisis arrives. Eric Klinenberg is a Helen Gould Shepard Professor of Social Science and Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He's the author of the new book, 2020, One City, Seven People, and the Year Everything Changed, as well as Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life, as well as Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone, Fighting for Air, The Battle to Control America's Media, and Heatwave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago. He's also the co-author with Aziz Ansari of the New York Times #1 bestseller, Modern Romance. Professor Klinenberg's scholarly work has been published in journals including the American Sociological Review, Theory and Society, the Ethnography, and he has contributed to the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stone, and the American Life. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. I will hand things over to you as I'm really excited to get started, and so are these folks.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. Thanks to everybody who's here. It's 8 in the morning in New York City, so it's a little bit early, and I see there's some Rhode Island here. I love that some of you are in Europe and joining from far away, and maybe it's a little closer to lunchtime over there, which is nice. Quick note before we get going, I live in the heart of New York City, and those of you who live in big cities know that occasionally things like this happen. So yesterday, a team came to my terrace and started putting massive amounts of scaffolding up. And apparently at some point this morning, I'm going to get visited by a whole crew of people who might start banging. So I'm hoping that happens after we finish. But my apologies if it gets a little bit loud before. I think we're going to be safe. I thought that I would start just by telling you a small amount about my kind of journey at Brown and how I became a social scientist, and then get into the story of this particular book and why I'm interested in what happened in 2020 and what I think we can learn from it. And I'll just say, I see a couple of you are starting to turn your screens on. That's so incredibly nice to see actual human faces. And every time I do a Zoom call now, I have this like throwback to 2020 where like, we were all stuck in our homes for some period of time. And this was like as close to contact as we got. And of course, I was teaching at the time. I'm a professor at NYU, and our classes all went remote. And I had these seminars I would teach, and sometimes big lecture classes. And it's a really weird thing to talk at a screen where you're just seeing people's names, but it's infinitely nicer when you see faces. So if you're in a situation where you happen to be able to turn on your camera and show your face, that makes it a little bit nicer for all of us. But if you can't do it, I understand that too. Anyway, I graduated from Brown in '93. I studied philosophy and history. And Brown was kind of transformative for me. There was nobody in my family who had done research and scholarship for a living. I didn't really know professors growing up. That idea that that was something you could do never occurred to me. And I got really turned on by some dynamic lectures at the university. I took this sequence of intellectual history classes that Mary Gluck taught in the history department, and I thought those were just amazing. I took a bunch of philosophy classes with Martha Nussbaum um, that were great. I loved doing research and writing. I also felt like the two things I had majored in didn't suit me perfectly. I loved reading history, but I thought I wasn't really temperamentally suited to spending my life in archives, kind of, living in books. I wanted to be around people. And so the idea of like doing history didn't quite work. And philosophy, well, I felt like at, 21, 22 years old, it would be a little silly for me to talk about things like what is a good life, because I didn't felt like I hadn't really lived much, and I didn't have like very clear ideas about that stuff, and I wanted to be in the world. So I got a job after I graduated, actually with a professor who taught community health at Brown. His name was David Lewis, and he was working on the uh, healthcare reform bill that the Clintons were working up at the time, and they needed a research assistant to look into the benefit for mental health and substance abuse treatment. And I took the job and wound up having this amazing experience for a year of going back and forth between Providence and Washington, D.C. to work on policy issues and also to do research. And I really like that combination of, being in the world and working on things that had some immediacy, talking to people, trying to come up with ideas for solving problems, and then ultimately being able to write and think as well. And after a couple of years out of college, I decided to apply for graduate school and wound up going to the sociology program at UC Berkeley. And just before I started graduate school in July of 1995, there was a heat wave that hit the city that I grew up in, Chicago. And I got really curious about what had happened there. Something like 700 people died in just a couple of days. And that seemed like an enormous amount of death from something that at the time seemed pretty benign. The heat. This is before the time when we were talking about climate change as a big issue, and uh, there wasn't a big discourse about the health threats of climate, and this just seemed kind of strange to me that this had happened. And I went to Chicago right before I started graduate school, and I started asking people questions about, what had happened and why. And it turned out there were all these puzzles. One of the puzzles is that although there were hundreds of deaths, so many that the city wound up bringing in these refrigerated trucks to deal with all the bodies that were coming into the medical examiner's office in such a short period of time. Lots of people in Chicago were questioning whether the disaster was really real. They thought maybe this is just kind of a media event that, like the journalists are blaming all of the deaths on the heat, and actually people die all the time in Chicago anyway. So what if this disaster wasn't really real? And then there was this other strange thing that happened, which is that I learned that the mayor and the health official and who ran the health department and the person who ran the human services division were kind of making the case that this was really an event where people neglected to take care of themselves, and so they died. And there was really nothing that the city could have done differently that would have avoided the crisis, and that didn't seem right to me. I started learning about the places where people died, and there were concentrations in some neighborhoods that were surprising to me. There was a really clear pattern of who was most vulnerable. If you looked at the maps of the city, on the south side of the city, on the west side of the city, there's a lot of inequality, a lot of segregation, a lot of vulnerability, and so most of the deaths were there. But then there were these pockets on the south and west side of Chicago where you had a lot of poverty and a lot of vulnerability, but actually really low levels of death. and no one had really tried to understand why there was variation among the different poor communities in Chicago that week. And I thought that was fascinating. So I started, working on this project, and soon enough it became my dissertation and then my first book. And I really launched my career as a social scientist around this question of, what happens during crises and what can we learn when we track how a society breaks down or how a society takes care of its most vulnerable people. And it kind of became my working theory of crises, that crises have this special value to people who are interested in understanding society. When you have a major crisis, we can learn who we are, we can learn what we value, we can learn whose lives matter. And implicitly, I think we learn whose lives don't matter as much. And so for about 20 years now, I've done research I've been at NYU for about 20 years. I taught at Northwestern briefly before I came here. And a lot of my work tries to look at these extreme events and tease out the lessons, from looking closely or pausing to consider things that maybe happened really quickly that we didn't pay a lot of attention to, but that have some other significance. And in fact, when January and February of 2020 came around, I was teaching a course at NYU on the social challenges of climate change. And one of the things I teach when I'm teaching about the social challenges of climate change is this thing that psychologists sometimes call the paradox of cognition. And that is that we tend to be most attuned to immediate threats, things that affect us today or in the here and now, and really significant threats that are that seem a little bit distant, but that could be really dire, often fail to register. We don't feel them in our bones in the same way, and we can be slow to react to them. And this is a classic problem with climate change, right? Which is, if you talk to people, even Americans, most people believe that the climate is changing, that the earth is getting warmer, that there's all these problems related to it. But even among those who care about it and think it's a big issue, it generally ranks pretty low compared to other more immediate concerns in people's lives. There's something going on with the economy or with health insurance or with your school system or with immigration. Whatever your issue is, it generally feels like it matters more today than climate change. And so the problem we have is that as these distant threats loom and we don't address them because they're not urgent, they get more and more severe. And with climate change, of course, the problem is that by the time it becomes the most important thing, the thing that feels like the thing we have to deal with today, it might be too late to deal with the amount of greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere. We might already have so many downstream risks and threats from global warming that it's become much more difficult to solve the problem. So I was lecturing about this in the beginning of 2020, as I generally do when I'm talking to undergraduates about climate. And I was looking for an example of something analogous to get their minds thinking about the moment. And I said, for instance, how many of you are concerned about this new coronavirus that they've detected in China? And when I first raised that question to a group of about 50 undergraduates at NYU in late January 2020, one student out of about 50 raised their hand, and that student had just come to New York from China as a foreign exchange student. And no one else really knew what this thing was. There was a lot of chuckles in the room. It was one of those questions that didn't really connect because it wasn't on people's mind. It seemed ridiculous. And over the course of the next several weeks, I started to ask the question routinely until we got to the point where not only was it the most urgent thing on people's mind, but it had become so urgent that the university decided to close and go remote. And at the time, it seemed like it might be just a few weeks, but of course, it wound up being about a year. I realized living in New York City that this event was going to be significant. I didn't know how significant the pandemic would be. and how it would affect us, what would happen in New York, what would happen in the US, what would happen in other countries. But I had this sense right away that it was probably worth tracking and focusing on because it was going to be, potentially a world-changing event. I also thought right away that there was an intervention that I could make as a social scientist based on some of my research. And so very early in the pandemic, in late March, I started to work on an essay which came out at that time in the New York Times, in which I made the point that the language that the World Health Organization and other officials were using to advise us on how to change our behavior to deal with this new threat was dangerous. And some people will probably remember the first kind of advice we got when we found out that there was this new virus circulating and the world started to shut down, is that the thing we needed to do to protect ourselves was to be socially distant. Remember that concept, social distancing? It kind of came out of nowhere. And I thought, well, I understand the impulse here, distancing seems right, but I was worried that the concept of social distancing actually had some bad ideas packed into it. I knew from other research that distancing during a crisis can mean that people who have resources, capacity to protect themselves can do it. They can seal themselves off, and social distancing kind of encourages you to get your family and gather together and lock your door and come out when the thing is over. But I also knew that there are enormous numbers of people who can't do that, for one reason or another, who depend on others, who don't necessarily have resources to take care of their needs, who maybe can't work remotely, who maybe can't get their food delivered to them, who perhaps have jobs that they have to keep on doing. And a society that says social distancing is the strategy for surviving might leave those people extremely vulnerable and wind up with a really unequal outcome. So what I wrote in this early article in the New York Times was the formula for getting through this crisis isn't social distancing, it's physical distancing and social solidarity. And the point was, yes, it's a bad idea to get really close to people when we don't have masks, when we don't have tests, when we can't trace this disease, when we don't know how to treat the disease, what it is. Of course, physical distancing makes sense, but we need the opposite of social distancing. We need solidarity, which in my world, in the social sciences, has to do with this notion that we are in fact interdependent, that our fate is affected by the fate of the people around us, that our behavior will be affected by the behavior of people around us. And in a society where people are capable of thinking collectively about how action here affects action there, and how we can coordinate our actions so that we do well together, we're much more likely to have success than as a society that's organized around hyper individualistic behavior, where everyone is taking care of themselves, distancing and taking care of themselves. So that was the first moment where I thought there's a lesson from the social sciences about what's about to happen that we should heed. And actually, not long after that, the WHO did start to change its language and emphasize physical distancing as opposed to social distancing. But in the popular imagination in a lot of countries around the world, that notion of social distancing stuck. And in my view, the consequences were pretty detrimental. After I wrote that essay, I got a lot of feedback from people who, wanted to hear more about how social scientific ways of thinking could help us make sense of what was happening during 2020. And I've worked with a foundation called the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation often over the years. It's a major funder of health research. And I reached out to them and told them I wanted to launch a really big research project with a team of people around the world looking at how different societies were responding to this one common threat. And they approved the grant proposal. And so starting in May of 2020, I assembled this team of researchers, and we came up with a plan for looking at the crisis as it unfolded over the year. that first year. And the original plan was that we were going to send people to countries around the world and try to do a lot of firsthand observation. And I'm sure some of you remember this part of 2020 that all the airports shut down and it became very difficult to travel. And there were many countries that didn't want you to come in. And so the borders were closed. And quickly we had to change our focus, and it became clear that we could do comparisons across countries, but we could not really have a lot of people on the ground. So the research changed, and I wound up working on two different tracks. On the one hand, by following policy reports and uh, uh, health data from around the world and different kind of disease monitoring, I was able to look at the way in which different countries responded to this one crisis at somewhat of a distance. But we were able to learn a lot of really important things about the international variation in the ways that countries responded to this threat. But then we also decided to take a much more intimate tack, and uh, we started doing hundreds of interviews with people around New York City, where I'm based, so that we could learn about the experiences, the very diverse set of experiences of people in the place that really became the epicenter of the crisis in 2020. And ultimately, as I delve more and more into our interview data, I realized that the best way to capture the human experience of what it felt like to live through that time and why the time was so challenging was to find a set of specific people. I found one person from every borough of New York City, and then two additional people, an MTA worker, a subway worker who worked in construction, who was a custodian who died very early in the pandemic, and an activist who got very involved in the Black Lives Matter protests, because of course in 2020, it wasn't just a year of the pandemic, it was also a year of protest and political upheaval as the US barreled towards this election. And so we had a seventh person who became a kind of a hardcore activist during that year. And so the book I wrote, which is called 2020, works on these two different tracks. There's a set of chapters that are making comparisons between the United States and other places, and that ask questions like, why did masks become so contentious and such a source of bitter conflict and violence in the US, but not in most places on Earth? Or why did violence spike in the United States, but again, not in most places? And then there's another set of chapters where there are these really deep profiles of people whose stories I think speak to more universal trends. And that's how the research project got designed and how the book came together. And what I want to do before we jump into conversation with each other is just give you an example of a couple of the things big ideas, I think, that emerged when I looked more closely at things in 2020 that maybe popped up for a moment and then disappeared. I've said this thing before, that I think crises reveal who we are and what we value. And I want to give you one quick example of this. One of the really surprising things that happened in the early days of the pandemic around the world is that governments really, for the first time in about a century, and some argue the first time ever, took very severe, stringent steps to reduce our mobility, to reduce economic activity, to reduce trade even, and we were encouraged to shut down, to go home, to leave the office, to not go to school, not to travel, not go to restaurants or bars. Some cases, not even to shop for certain things that we didn't need right away. We all remember that time. And public health scholars have said this was really a historically sweeping effort to protect human life. And it's notable that it became clear somewhat early in the pandemic that not everyone was affected equally by the disease, and some people, some population groups would be far more at risk than others. For instance, if you were very old, your chances of dying of COVID were much higher than if you were very young. If you had underlying health conditions, your chances of dying were much higher. And in a kind of surprising move, countries around the world made these, very kind of extreme decisions to protect those lives, even if it came at great economic costs. And I'm not saying that in a normative way. I'm not judging it one way or the other. Some people think that was a great decision. Some people think that was a terrible decision. I'm just trying to call attention to the fact that it is notable how sweeping and global and immediate those things came into being. And they do reflect a certain way of valuing human life. Although, of course, as the pandemic would go on, we would see that not every society could sustain that commitment, and that the value of protecting human life, actually varied tremendously across societies and even within some. At that moment, when we were encouraged to shut down, it became clear that there were some people who still needed to work. Right? And for me, like, one of the first things that pops out when I say disasters or crises reveal things about us is when we had this moment, when things were really scary and we didn't know what we could do to get through this and just how deadly the disease would be. We as a society, as a state, said, everyone should stay home, no school, no work, with the exception of a certain set of people whose labor, we said, is so valuable, right? Is so important, so valuable, so important, that we're going to give them a special designation, right? Some people, we need to go out into the workforce, even if they don't have all of the PPE, medical equipment, even if we don't know how to treat this virus, and we're going to give them a special designation. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you remember this concept, anyone? The concept was essential workers, right? Remember, so we came, suddenly there was this new idea. There's some people who are essential workers, and they deserve special treatment. Now, this is kind of an amazing notion, right? I live in New York City. We all know who the essential workers are in New York City, right? They're the finance guys, they're the people who work in the white shoe law firms, they're the NBA players, right? Well, of course, those aren't the actual essential workers. Those are the people who make the most money, right? Those are the people who kind of generate the most value in the labor market and who kind of run the city. But in fact, it's an open secret in our society that those are not essential workers, right? That our values and what's valued in the marketplace are in some ways out of sync, right? What's valuable for the functioning of society is not necessarily reflected in the labor market. So who was an essential worker? Well, there are people who worked retail. There are people who did, public transit. There were the custodians who cleaned up. There are people who maintained infrastructure. They were people who worked in agriculture, farm workers. There were people who worked in meatpacking plants, in some factories. There were, of course, the healthcare workers. And some of you might remember that in New York City, this ritual emerged, which was that at the end of the workday, as medical workers were coming home, people went outside and banged pots and pans to show their solidarity, to show respect, to give thanks. And for those certain classes of healthcare workers, mainly doctors and nurses, that was a kind of moment of great recognition and appreciation. But the thing that stands out so much for me is that in this moment of crisis, when we created this concept, essential workers, one would think that a society that does that would be creating a new set of moral obligations. Because when you say the thing out loud, like there's some people who are essential, there's some jobs that are essential, some laborers that are essential, it seems as if what you would be committing to is that in exchange for doing this very risky work, we will make sure you get whatever PPE is available. We will make sure you get access to the best healthcare available. We will compensate you, maybe, right? We'll give you some kind of bonus. We will honor you. We will recognize you. We will take care of you. And of course, we needed to do this because the people who were essential workers, they weren't just putting themselves at risk. if you were going out into the world and working during those first months of the pandemic, you had a much higher chance of contracting the virus and bringing it home to all the people who lived with you, right? So by being an essential worker, you were not just putting yourself at risk, but also everyone in your world. And so what was really striking to me is that, in fact, uh, when we called people essential workers, we didn't provide them with any of those things, right? We didn't provide anything really in exchange for that. In the United States, to be honest, to be called an essential worker was really to be deemed expendable. And instead of honor and protection and recognition and compensation, what happened to the essential workers is that they had far higher rates of mortality. Their family members had far higher rates of mortality, and they were never really given bonuses. They were never given special protection. It's and it's odd because the creation of that concept, the essential worker, was one of those moments where, and maybe some of you experienced them too, where you could see the possibility that this event was going to change things, that this event was going to blow open the facade, and we would all learn who we really were, and we would do things better, protect each other more effectively, become more humane, maybe rely on the marketplace less. And in fact, what happened with the essential workers is it was like we got to the edge of this moral precipice just at a moment where it looked like we were going to make a breakthrough, and then we just walked away like it never happened. And so I'm guessing that very few of you on this call today have been talking a lot about essential workers recently. We've kind of forgotten that we said this thing. And so one of the things I do in my book and my research is say, like, well, wait a minute, let's dwell on this a little longer and think about what it means that when push came to shove and we all were afraid for our lives, we came up with this concept, we came up with this idea, we asked people to do this thing. Maybe we could revisit it and talk about, what it means to be an essential worker and what you are owed for that. That's one of the ideas that came out from doing this research. Another thing I wanted to share with you has to do with this kind of comparative question. What happened in different societies, and what can we learn from that? And one of the questions that people are kind of fascinated by is, why is it that masks were so contentious? I brought this up before. Like, what happened with this whole mask issue? You would think in the abstract that if there's some new threat, airborne disease, and it has a decent chance to make you very sick, potentially with long-term illnesses, or it has a chance to kill you. But if you wear this mask, you could dramatically reduce your chances of getting sick or giving an illness to someone else, passing it to someone else. One might think that that's not a big ask. It's not that big a deal to wear a mask for some time. And there are a lot of countries in the world where wearing a mask has become widely accepted, quite common, and not too big a deal. Some of those countries have a history of dealing with viral threats. So we know that mask wearing is more common in Asian societies, and in many parts of Asia, the development of masks as a public health technology is a source of pride, a kind of sign of, like, the mask is a sign of acceptance of solidarity and of a feeling of togetherness, of mutual responsibility. There are a number of countries that were affected by the SARS virus in 2003 and 2004. That includes Australia and New Zealand and Canada, and they learned some lessons about the value of mask wearing and of getting PPE out very quickly. But of course, there are a lot of societies in the world where masks are rarely used and unusual. And in the UK, for instance, I know that someone here is outside of London right now. mask wearing was not especially popular. People didn't like to wear masks, but a really notable thing about mask wearing in the first year of the pandemic in the UK is that whether you wore a mask had very little to do with your political ideology. It wasn't organized around which political team you were on, which is a kind of cultural personal preference. In the United States, the story was really different, and I wanted to understand why, because as many of you recall in the US, within a few weeks of the mask guidelines, people weren't just disagreeing about whether masks were good to wear. There were heated conflicts, and in many cases, homicides and violent assaults in public places, grocery stores, public parks, eventually in airplanes and other forms of transit, heated, violent conflicts in Starbucks, at gas stations, about people wearing masks or not wearing masks. And I thought like that was fascinating, and I wanted to understand why. And I looked at the record of how the U.S. evolved new policies around masks, and learned a fascinating thing. That initially, in the early stages of the pandemic, masks were not required. The WHO did not urge countries to impose mask mandates or even mask recommendations. There was a lot of concern at the WHO that we didn't have enough masks in the global supply, and they didn't want to deprive healthcare workers of masks when they needed them. They also said that they didn't have direct evidence that this new virus could be prevented from spreading by mask wearing. And that shouldn't be surprised, because it was a new virus, so there was no research on it. And that, so countries that were more inclined to use the precautionary principle to establish policies said, we should use it anyway, but many did not. So in early April, the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention issued guidelines saying, Americans should wear masks in public. And the person who announced that policy change is the previous president, who's now running again for office. I don't know. Some of you might know we have an election coming up in America. I'm sure you might be following that. So Donald Trump announces this policy, and presidents don't have unlimited power in the US. In fact, their power is quite checked. But one way in which we know that presidents are highly influential is that when there's a moment of uncertainty and people don't really know what's going on or what to do, we rely on the White House in the United States, or on higher offices in government, to give us guidance and to frame a situation and set an agenda. And so the president's counsel is really important at moments like this. Presidential leadership really matters during crises. So in early April, Trump addresses the country at a first press conferences, and he tells everybody about this new mask mandate. The CDC says you should wear a mask when you're in public around other people. It'll prevent you from getting the disease. It will prevent other people from contracting the disease or spreading it. That's the first thing he says. And he pauses for a moment and he says, personally, I'm not going to do it. Which is a very confusing public health message, right? To say that our major epidemiology and public health arm of government is saying you need to do this, but I am personally going to choose not to do it. And it becomes very clear that this is not just a personal preference, but in the White House inner circle, everyone who's connected to the president realizes that he sees mask wearing as kind of cowardly, as feminine, as a sign of weakness. And he does not want people associated with the White House and his party to be seen in masks. And so very soon after that, there's this amazing moment where Mike Pence, the vice president, who also some of you might remember was the head of the White House's task force on COVID. For many people, a surprising decision, because most countries had health experts do that. We did not. Mike Pence goes to the Mayo Clinic, which is a kind of facility you go to, an institution you go to in the United States if your medical problems are so complicated, so vexing, that your home hospital, your medical team, wherever you live, can't solve the problem. So really, people with really major medical needs. Mike Pence goes to the Mayo Clinic, and he is the only person in the zip code who refuses to wear a mask. And there are these photographs and videos of Pence surrounded by doctors and patients, everyone masked except for him. And soon it becomes clear that for everyone in America who's on Team Red, burying your face and not wearing a mask in the, despite the Trump administration own government's advice, bearing your mask is a sign of solidarity with people who share your views about government. It's right, to show your face is a way of saying, I'm on Team Red. I think government shouldn't have the power to shut things down. I believe in this certain version of individualism and freedom. And suddenly this mask becomes very politicized. But it's not just on Team Red that we see this happen, because what happens on Team Blue is that Team Blue realizes that wearing a mask is now a sign of solidarity with another set of ideas about following the science, about public health, about mutual responsibility. So now all the Democrats start to change their political advertisements so that they're wearing a mask in their ads. And people on social media who belong to Team Blue, they change their Twitter hashtag to, Eric hashtag wears a mask Klinenberg, or my social media photograph becomes me in a mask. And if you're walking down the street in the United States and you saw other people wearing a mask in April, May, June 2020, that was a sign that you're on Team Blue. And of course, it didn't break down that way exclusively. There were lots of older conservatives who wore masks. There were lots of younger Democrats who didn't wear masks. But for the most part, what happened in the United States in 2020 is that this little piece of fabric suddenly was carrying the weight of all of our political and ideological struggles, right? We had invested this meaning. It had become an icon, a kind of totem of who we are and what we value. And a striking thing that happened in the US during that year is what began with masks then moved into medications, right? The Democrats had a medication, remdesivir, and then the Republicans had another medication, ultimately ivermectin. But there's all these, ideas about what the best medication was that was polarized and politicized. Of course, then it happened with the vaccine, right? So arguably one of the great accomplishments of the Trump administration in 2020 is, speeding up the development and the release of vaccines. And some of you might remember that Trump really wanted the FDA to release the vaccine a month before the election. And he wanted, everyone getting vaccinated and to feel like to give him credit for it and to feel like he had gotten the United States through this thing. The FDA said it wasn't ready to approve, didn't approve it until January. And by the time that FDA approved it, Trump had been voted out of office, and he didn't want Biden to get credit for the vaccine. So he turned against the vaccine and refused to really publicly endorse it, even though months before he had called it his own accomplishment. And so vaccines got more politicized in the United States, to the extent that now not only are people skeptical about COVID vaccines, depending on their political perspective, but all other vaccines have become the source of ideological controversy. And, I think tragically, one of the things that I've become concerned about is that this whole field of public health and the whole question of governance around health crises has been politicized, polarized, enough that I fear that today we're actually less capable of dealing with a new pandemic than we were in 2019 or early 2020. And we all saw how badly the US handled that year. So I think, in my book, I spend a little less time kind of going through exactly why some countries had higher death rates and some countries had lower death rates, although I do spend some time on that. I spent a little more time trying to understand the broader kind of social and political and civic fallout, cultural fallout from that year, so that we can have a better sense of, where we are now. And I'm going to wrap, because I want to give us some time to have conversation, by just saying, I think, oddly, as the year 2020 ended, the vaccines rolled out, and people decided that the pandemic was over. People on both sides of the political spectrum decided to kind of put it away, put it in a box, throw it in the closet, and act almost as if that experience hadn't really happened. I think we've been in a rush to get beyond that really tough year of 2020 and to not think about it anymore. I've written that it's like we have a kind of will not to know about this set of crises that we live through. And unfortunately, just as in our personal lives, in our collective life, repressing something that's traumatic and pretending that it didn't happen and that we didn't live through it is not a very functional way to deal with it. And so when I look at the conversations in the United States today, when I think about why so many Americans feel so frustrated and upset and dissatisfied, think that the country is off track, want dramatic change, feel the sense of their blood boiling. I can't help but think that part of what's driving that is that during the year 2020, the distrust, the division, the polarization, these things that had been brewing in our society for many years got intensified, got hardened, got lodged deep inside of us. And because we have really refused to go back and make sense of how that all happened and what we lived through, they're still there driving us. And in odd ways, here we are in 2024 facing, another election of our lifetime with many of the same issues at stake. And the kind of country's social fabric seems more fragile, more torn than it has in some time. So I'm happy to open it up for conversation. I see already a note about Brazil, and so we could talk about other countries and the things they've experienced. Maybe some of you want to share it. My claim in the book is not that the U.S. is completely unique, and of course, one of the things that Brazil shares with the United States is that it also had a kind of strongman figure in office who I think, like Trump, Bolsonaro really used the pandemic as a kind of wedge issue to solidify groups rather than to try to unite and build this thing that I think we needed to get through, solidarity. Brazil is one of the countries that has had some odd similarities to the United States, not just in its experience with COVID in terms of polarization and violence and disagreements around the pandemic, but with this enduring legacy of civil unrest, which resulted in a siege on the government that was strikingly similar to what the United States experienced in January 6th. So the United States, I don't want to say it's unique in the world in the extent to which our leaders divided us rather than united us during this time, but the U.S. is really on the extreme side of it. Anyway, let's open it up more generally. So I don't know, Alexia, how do you want to take questions through the chat, or can people jump in and use the mics?
Sure. However, anybody would like to jump in. We have another question of why do you think COVID became so politicized in the US and Brazil, but less so elsewhere?
Well, I mean, again, I think leadership was tremendously important. I think I'm generally pretty skeptical of the idea that what happens in nations is kind of really determined by leadership from above. I think generally that society plays a big role. And we have a tendency to overestimate the influence of, the national government on a lot of issues, but there are some issues where the federal government really does matter. The national government has an outsized influence. So I think countries where leaders recognize the value of building solidarity and finding a way to have a more united responses had a huge edge over countries where strongman leaders tried to kind of do it on their own and increase their power and authority with whatever policies they favored based on their ideological predispositions. In the book, I read a lot about Australia because it's a fascinating comparison case with the U.S. Some of you will remember that in the beginning of 2020, Australia was led by Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who is very conservative, much like Trump or Boris Johnson, who's in charge in the UK at the time, or in England. Morrison has a record as a science denier. Australia had just lived through these catastrophic bushfires, and Morrison always refused to associate the bushfires with climate change. Really adamant denier of climate change. And Australia, like the US, has a federal government, which means the states have a lot of autonomy and states could kind of do their own thing. And Australia, by the way, had relatively high levels of distrust and polarization going into 2020. But rather than divide and assert his own kind of ideological solution to the crisis, Morrison assembled this team of ministers from all the states, not just the state leaders, but also the health leaders from each state. They came up with a relatively unified plan. States had some capacity to set their own local policy, but there was a quite coordinated federal plan. They shut the borders pretty early. They invested in PPE. They put in elaborate systems for testing and tracing, and managed to have one of the lowest death rates in the world, while also dramatically increasing levels of trust. I've seen one study that shows that if the United States had the same mortality rate as Australia from COVID, 900,000 Americans would still be alive today. And that's a staggering number, right? 900,000 people. And to be completely clear about it, Morrison didn't act perfectly, and it turned out that there was a big controversy in 2021 when people discovered that he'd actually legislatively made himself second in command of a number of federal agencies at the time, and this with this emergency measure. So there was a little bit of a power grab that Morrison made, but during the year, the policies they came up with collectively were quite sane and widely accepted. Yes, there were some demonstrations in the state of Victoria about long lockdowns. Not everybody, people obviously really chafed at restrictions, and people around the world struggled to deal with, lockdowns, school closures, office closures of gathering places. I mean, there were really dire effects of these programs on human health and well-being. We know about the impact of school closures on kids' education. So all of these policy decisions involve trade-offs that are hard to make. So I don't want to say that everything was done perfectly, but clearly we can see real disparities in the countries where a leader tried to impose his own solution that had a kind of ideological bent, and places where leaders were able to summon some collective goodwill and solidarity from the society more generally. And I think for me, one of the big lessons of this event is the shortcomings of this kind of hyper individualistic culture and form of government. But here we are, in 2024, and that debate of whether a more collective approach or a more individualistic, it's up to you what you do approach is going to win out. And in the U.S. in this election, I think that's very much on the ballot. Right, there are a lot of people whose concern about what we did in 2020 will in some way shape their vote. And here's another reason I wanted to write this book. I think there has been a lot of revisionist history about what we lived through in 2020. And it's not at all clear to me that Americans realize all the ways in which the pandemic experience was so much worse here than it was in other places.
Right. We're almost at time. We've two more questions left, so we'll try
Okay.
to squeeze them in.
And I'll try to be fast.
So New York instituted a controversial public policy measure where you were required to get the vaccine or face termination. This applied to public and private sector employees. Do you think this was the right decision?
Yeah, I mean, that was a very controversial decision. And it's not clear to me that kind of permanent termination was the right thing. Nor do I recall whether the terminations were lasted, whether they were in fact permanent. I do think that there's legal justification to bar people from workplaces in a public health crisis if they refuse to take a vaccine that would potentially reduce the threat. I could imagine a situation with a far more deadly virus. Imagine a virus that's highly contagious, highly lethal, and that, for instance, affects kids most, right? Affects children most. In that situation, it seems to me like it'd be a very reasonable thing to say that anyone who's teaching in a school who has access to a vaccine that would dramatically reduce the odds of transmitting the disease and killing children, that they would be, they could not work if they didn't get vaccinated. So I think that there's a case for it. And at the time, it seemed like a reasonable thing for me. I think the question of whether you have a program to reincorporate people when the crisis is over is an important one. And I have to say, I don't know exactly how New York or other states have dealt with that employment situation. But by all means, I think our public health agency should have the capacity to require vaccines and other forms of and other interventions during crises.
Eric, thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who participated and submitted questions. I hope I got as many as I could. I know we're a little bit over, but thank you. This has been such a fascinating session, and I so appreciate your time and volunteering to share your research with the community. It was so insightful and taking us back in time to 2020 and reflecting. It wasn't that long ago. So, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for everyone's participation.
Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.